Harold Weston, 78, would lock the front gate every evening just before the sun set below the ridge. To his humble farm nestled in the heart of the Appalachian foothills, where there was nothing but solitude for miles. He lived alone by choice and habit, and the only sound he heard was the rustle of trees brushing against the wind. He no longer felt compelled to explore the recollection of the world, which was nearly 3 kilometers away, but on one unusually warm. A stranger stood on the dry grass in the late October evening as the sky turned orange and the shadows grew longer. A slender guy with a ripped jacket emerged from the tree line, eyes too alert to be. Harold spotted the man, and the man noticed Harold, who smirked innocuously and as if he had already chosen how the night would finish. Harold didn't initially move, but what transpired next would not only alter Harold's life trajectory, but also bring to life something that has been forgotten and buried deep in the jungle. Nobody has ever seen it this close. Civilization over many years. And when it emerged from the quiet of the Harold, the darkness not only stopped the attack, but also caused everyone to wonder who was really keeping an eye on them from the woods. Weston had spent the most of the previous 20 years with solitude, so he had never been the type of man who feared it. Carefully growing it while avoiding the bustle of cities and the stress of social interaction, opting instead for old books, the peaceful companionship of trees, and the predictable rhythm of caring for a piece of land that is too obstinate for. Who else would care about his house? A groaning 2-bedroom farmhouse that his grandfather had constructed was perched on the edge. In Southern Virginia, on a deserted road, where the woods were so near to the porch that on rainy evenings the sound of there were owls that sounded as though they were sitting on the rafter itself. It was a life. Essentials only, unadorned, but not unloved till the evening of the stranger. Harold had repaired a piece of fencing that the deer continued to push after the afternoon had gone by like any other. He carried in several buckets of well water and placed traps for the raccoons that broke into his chicken coop. As the sun sank behind the hills, he had lighted the oil lamp in the kitchen in case the pump chose to malfunction once more, sat down in his usual chair, and drank a tin mug of weak tea, allowing the house's silence to become warm and lingering. Suddenly, a sharp creak sprang from the front porch. At first, he thought it may be a possum trying its luck or the wind, but when the sound resurfaced, it was heavier and slower. Harold's gut twisted, not so much out of fear as out of instinct, the type that had sustained him during a tour in his career through 2 childhood crimes and a lifelong realization that sometimes silence indicates danger is close by. So he stood cautiously and reached for the antique, unloaded hunting rifle that was positioned above the mantel. Neat for decades, but it was still clean, functional, and headed for the door. He could just make out the tall, slender person standing on the porch through the thin curtain, with part of his face obscured. The man then spoke under his sweatshirt. His words were straightforward, but the voice, even old man, the stranger's voice was incorrect, stretching out the vowels like someone who wasn't rushing to go and may not have intended to. Harold didn't answer right away. He was still standing behind the flimsy curtain. In the lamplight, the rifle's shape could be seen in his other hand. Leaning against the doorframe, he recognized the tone of the voice, but not the man. A type of forced civility intended to gain time rather than to reassure, to measure the amount of anxiety he could extract from a silence. "What do you want?" Harold asked in a flat, authoritative voice that wasn't elevated, taking just enough time to allow the stranger moved his weight, and the other man realized that he was still in control of himself and had more spine than bone. Harold could barely see anything in the dim light, but he heard a faint clinking sound, like that of metal keys or a chain. "I saw the light," the man continued, "just passing through, thinking perhaps I could get some." Harold's first serious warning was that the water might warm up a little because it wasn't frigid. Harold said, "Water here. The pump is dry. You want to go back east. He didn't disclose that the road had washed out 2 months prior, so the petrol station about 10 miles down should still be open. A flash flood, and that, considering the state of the path, it seems improbable that the stranger had entered through the woods. He must have realized that the man had already been silent for a moment before he burst out laughing. "That's so, Harold, loud, not mean, just gentle enough to make Harold's skin crawl. opened the door just a bit so that Harold could see the rifle's muzzle moving for a brief moment, would conclude with the stranger shrugging, possibly cursing, and then retreating back into the trees. But instead, Harold realized as soon as the stranger took one step forward and then another. This was about controlling the situation, not about finding water or shelter. Before Harold could respond, the door sprang open, and the stranger rushed forward, severing the rifle with one hand. Harold staggered backward as the other slammed a fist in his chest, knocking the air out of his lungs and his ribs. Flaring in agony as he struck the kitchen table and fell to the ground, he attempted to grab the weapon, but it had reached the area next to the stove. But the man was already on top of him, holding him down with one knee while pulling with the other. Something came out of his jacket, a short, non-long knife that wasn't the type utilized for hunting or coercion, yet brief, effective, and horrifyingly commonplace, such as, the man muttered, "I don't want to hurt you really," using a tool for quiet things. His breath was hot and sour against Harold's face, but you understand that Harold didn't like it when people told me what to do. He was unable to respond because of a ringing in his ears and a pressure in his chest. The hit had knocked something free inside him, leaving his left hand numb, and he knew that if this continued for much longer, he wouldn't be rising once more, and a deep guttural sound occurred at that moment. Unplaceable, initially reverberated from outside the threshold. It wasn't a bark or a. Wilder froze as he mumbled, growled something deeper. What the heck was that? Harold looked toward the open door. He couldn't see it yet, but he sensed a change in the atmosphere, a presence. Then the sound returned near this moment and, unmistakably, the man growled. Not a dog or other household animal. Got to his feet, immediately alert, knife still in hand, eyes darting to the open doorway as though something may. Emerging from the shadows, he carefully retreated, allowing Harold to take a deep breath and rolled gently onto his side and grab at his ribs, followed by steady, purposeful footsteps that weren't the scavenger's frantic scramble, but the man's padding confidence of something that had nothing to fear. "What is it you have, a dog?" Harold didn't respond since he was standing up. A massive gray wolf with a thick coat was now visible in the doorway, its form only illuminated by the wavering lamplight behind it. And brimming with moisture from the night air, its gaze was focused on the man holding the knife, rather on Harold. The guy stepped back again and raised the blade, saying, "I'll cut it. I'll swear." The wolf moved so fast that it was nearly a silver flash. The knife followed by the muscle hail snarl that tore through the air like thunder. Harold was lying broken on the ground when the man shouted and clattered to the ground. Could only observe for what seemed like an eternity as the wild filled the void left by justice. Boundaries of breath and time. The cabin was filled with a tumultuous atmosphere that did not roar, but rather shivered with the muffled thud of a body. As it stood above the intruder's enormous chest, the wolf's howling breath struck the ragged on the floor, rising and falling with calm, purposeful force, as though it had been called forth not by chance. But Harold is still on the ground after a long time, and, wide bloodshot eyes gazed as he struggled to draw oxygen through a tight circle of pain around his chest. With one hand up, the stranger who had attacked him made a valiant attempt to crawl backward. The other was gripping the shallow cut that was already growing over his forearm like a red scab in self-defense. Blossom blooming in the moonlight, the knife that just a few seconds before had been a tool of total, and, with its blade glinting feebly in the lamplight like an old coin lost, the terrible control now lay forgotten next to the stove. The wolf in dust didn't strike again. It just stood there without having to move. The ground stared at the man, as though assessing him not only as a danger but as something more profound, human, frail, and broken. And even though its message did not advance, it was, clearly, if you give it another go, you won't be able to breathe outside of this spot. The rustle of dry leaves strewn on the porch and the creaking of limbs were brought on by the increased wind. The sound of something moving in the forest, something invisible, as though the woods themselves had woken up and now tuned their ears in the direction of this cabin, anticipating the man's next breath. But he was terrified and no longer able to conceal it. He scurried to the entrance, knocking over furniture and dragging his feet through splinters. As he staggered into the night and vanished down the stairs, his curses were garbled and more animal than human. Into the brush with the awkwardness of someone who has lost all self-assurance, strength, and above all. Harold didn't attempt to stop him because he couldn't have it, even if he had wanted to, and instead stayed in his current position. Was partially huddled on the kitchen floor, his fingers moving in the direction of the weapon, which was now only a few inches away from his boot. The wolf, still motionless and silent, turned to face him, so he no longer felt the urge to reach for it, with animosity or danger, but with a spooky, unwavering serenity that contained none of the savage mayhem he would have anticipated from an animal of such untamed birth, but instead expressed something very different. Realizing that it was in the eyes, which had a soft amber hue that gleamed in the dim light, not like fire but like. Harold recognized something in the frost under the moonlight that he couldn't identify, couldn't describe, and wouldn't dare. Put simply, it was presence rather than thankfulness or comfort. Observe a quiet recognition that what had just transpired was something more than a coincidence or a miracle. The wolf persisted between a natural event interfering with the ABS of justice. Its muscles gradually relax, and its breath softens for a few more seconds before the only sound left is a whisper. Scuffing wood with its claws, it turned and passed through the open door, disappearing into the darkness as though it had never been there. Harold was unable to move for a long time because his legs and ribcage hurt with each breath, felt weak and alien, as if they were no longer his. But it wasn't the injuries that kept him on the ground. Rather, it was the gravity of what he had just seen, the impossibility of it, and the extreme impossibility of a wild animal showing up in the ideal moment, acting with accuracy and self-control, and vanishing without. Eventually, after a lot of work and the kind of stubbornness that had kept him alive longer than most people anticipated, Harold used the table as leverage to lift himself upright and, holding on to him with a grip that grew stronger when he eventually emerged from the night was silent once more, but not in the same sense. There was only measured stillness instead of any thread in the silence. The following morning, patient watching did not arrive with the same pale blue serenity Harold had become used to in his isolated area of Virginia, but with a dense, asymmetrical air, as if the forest itself had released something heavy at night, leaving its breath hanging over the valley like a thick fog. Yet it was too warm and motionless to be. Harold sat on the side of his bed with his chest wrapped in a cloth and a mug of bitter coffee on the nightstand, firmly in gauze, his ribs hurting from the bruising that had appeared on his side overnight like a time-spreading bruise. Suffering in an unsaid reason he hadn't phoned the sheriff or driven to. The shortwave radio crackled in the corner of his eye, but he hadn't even told anyone what had transpired in the clinic kitchen, so how could he explain it? How could a man who is grounded in logic and years of work and S's quiet reveal to someone that a wolf he replayed saved him? Not by chance or intervention. It came back to him as he searched for a fragment of it dozens of times between half-slumber and gasping alertness. No matter how many times, the memory that revealed fantasy included a hint of illusion or trauma-induced distortion. As he went around it, he kept coming back to the same indisputable fact. The thing had actually been there and observed him, had decided to take action, and something about that decision unnerved him much more than the actual violence just after noon. Harold's porch was illuminated by long, golden beams as the sun finally broke through the cloud cover above. He got up and strolled about his property, not because he thought the man would come back. However, due to his aging bones, they informed him that this story was not yet complete, and the door was still splintered from. The attacker's front step was broken with such power that it was faintly smeared with blood where he tripped. Fear, and close to the pile of wood beneath the overhang, where dew always stayed. Thickest there were footprints, but not just one or boot prints, or two a trail. Harold walked carefully behind them, squirming as each motion made his chest ache, but he ignored it since he had to know in order to comprehend. Surpassed all other instincts. The tracks were distinct, hefty, and purposefully wider than those of any coyote. He followed them along the tree, keeping a distance from them that suggested a stride full of purpose and cleaner than any dog. line across the meadow's edge, where the deer frequently browsed, past the little opening in the fence, and into the forest where, in spite of the sun, the light changed and the air became frigid. When he noticed it, something that was partially hidden by leaves and dirt beneath the slanting trunk of an ancient white oak was a little wooden talisman, little larger than a man's palm, that didn't belong in these woods, or at least not anymore. Clumsily fashioned in the style of a hand-carved, aged, and darkened wolf silhouette, a thin piece of leather that was tied at the end, as if it had been worn as a pendant or necklace, and had been engraved on the underside with odd lines, hooks, and symbols that have nothing to do with Latin or English. Harold recognized the language, but it carried a weight and force that made his fingers go motionless as soon as he flipped it over. He carefully lifted it, sweeping the dirt off its surface, and felt as if he looked around the room, trembling from something that wasn't cold but ancient, but he wouldn't say it out loud or even to himself. Clearing one's eyes and looking for movement and shadows to find any explanation, he looked up toward the edge of slight incline, wondering how or why this object had come to be here. Then a hill, but a figure that wasn't a man, stood there, partially protected by trees and mist. Not exactly a beast, it vanished in an instant, a blur that vanished again. Harold would not have believed he saw anything at all if it weren't for the sound as he moved smoothly into the trees. Sound came after a long, low, echoing howl. Harold recognized something in the sound, which was melancholy and completely isolated. Scared him more than the knife, the stranger, and the anguish this crevice caused. This wolf had been observing for a while and was not lost. Harold Weston had never been a man who was prone to fantasy or attributed to episodes of superstition or belief in things that are not measurable, or fixable with the right. With tools and a steady parrow, he started to feel as though a weight had been placed on him. Not only the object's weight, which felt light, dry, and abrasive against his hand, but also the psychological burden of realizing that the world he believed he understood was constrained by antiquated maps and simple explanations. May have just moved slightly beneath his boots, but he stayed motionless for a considerable amount of time, allowing the shadows to lengthen, and the sound of the birds will distract Cadence long enough for the cold to creep under his coat and remind him. Knew he still had fractured ribs and was made of flesh and blood, but he couldn't muster the strength to leave behind what he had witnessed, or perhaps more accurately, what had witnessed him, since that moment on the ridge when he noticed the outline of something as his gaze raised toward the row of trees. Observing from just outside reason's boundaries had signaled a sort of turning point. He returned to the cabin, not just in the day, but also in his comprehension of the very sequence of events, carefully tracing the same path taken by the hapless prince, which by this point had started to wane due to the fluctuating winds and falling leaves, but which he was still able to trace using a sort of instinctive attraction that he was yet unable to describe, such as the recollection of a smell or the reverberation of an impulse that has been hidden for decades under decades of peaceful, civilized survival. Arrange the talisman on the table with the kind of attention typically given to antiques or handwritten letters that are no longer existence, and he took a seat next to it, gazing for a long time without fear or bewilderment, but in a necessary, almost sacred quiet, as if speaking too quickly or too loudly could upset the delicate equilibrium of whatever had started to happen. And then at last he decided not to seek assistance, record anything, or even write in the little spiral notebook where he occasionally used an AOX lined with newspaper to record weather trends and gardening schedules from 1962, with a subtle scent of cedar and turpentine within, which contained a shattered pocket watch, a tarnished dog tag, and the strewn remains of another life. A faded picture of a woman with storm-like eyes, and, surprisingly, a book. The little book, which had belonged to his grandfather, was bound in cracked leather and kept together with a loop of thread. A hunter, a woodsman, and in more private settings, a man with bizarre and intricate tales that Harold had heard as a boy, until he was mature enough to reject them as the digressions of a generation too near to him. He once thought they were true. Myth, But now that he has the talisman on his table, and the howl's echo is still present in his bones, spine, he started to question whether the elderly man had any knowledge that he did not. Moved gently through the pages, noting animal footprints and curing pelts, until he came to a section, labeled with a single phrase in purposeful block letters that appeared to. Some areas of these hills, particularly those along the forest limits and historic graveyards, have been inhabited for generations, had claimed seeing animals that weren't human or beastly and only showed up when blood had been shed, or the same silence that brought them there vanished along with the threat to innocence, leaving just. Harold sat back in his chair, asking questions, warning him, and even offering protection. He didn't believe in ghosts, so he held the book on his lap and slowly breathed through his nose. Ghosts, but he was a believer in patterns, and the more he examined what had transpired at the odd moment, the carved talisman concealed beneath the oak tree, the wolf's arrival, and now this. The older he became aware that something had been happening, the more his deteriorating journal appeared to murmur bits of explanation. Protecting his property long before he ever claimed it as his own, and perhaps in the days that followed, it had made the decision to finally show itself as the bruises along Harold's. As the brittle October air got sharper, the ribcage developed into an unlead map of drab violets and yellowish blues. With a quiet method, but due to the existence of an invisible, intangible burden that appeared to create a tension in the cabin that wasn't dangerous, but wasn't totally harmless either. Similar to the quiet that descends moments before lightning strikes a sweltering July sky, the kind of quiet that becomes tingle and your breathing slows down, but you're not entirely sure why he initially attempted to deny it, citing the pain of his wounds or the psychological fallout from the assault. But the more frequently he woke up at, his heart was steady during those odd hours, just before dawn, when his eyelids sprung open. But instead of being disturbed, he felt awake as though he had been called, and the more he suspected that the presence was not in, his head wasn't imagined, and it wasn't neutral either. Terror wasn't present. It was consciousness, a clear feeling that he was no longer completely alone, not only in the physical sense of interruption of isolation, but in a more profound and primordial sensation of being watched, measured, and somehow acknowledged, followed by the first, faint indications of the kinds of things he could almost explain away the subtle but intentional footprints that appeared overnight just beyond the porch without losing sleep. On the ice and gone watery eyes, as if they had witnessed a shadow go through them rather than above them. The aroma of, at twilight, there's something strange in the air that isn't quite foul, like iron soaked in moss, something wild, frigid, and metallic. And then without, Ross Hanley, the warning sheriff, pulled up the gravel route in his old police truck, complaining that it was moving more slowly than usual and pulling his cap. He didn't get permission beforehand, and his posture was more rigid than the weather called for and lower than the autumn wind required. Instead of nodding or grinning as he stepped outside, he simply stood by the open door with one hand resting on the. For a few seconds, he chewed on the stillness with his mouth before saying, "Don't repeat this, but they found a hiker's body up near Millstone Ridge 2 days ago, possibly the remains of one more." Regardless, Harold didn't respond visibly, didn't ask the sheriff inside, and didn't even blink, but behind a silent threat of, as if he'd been waiting for this kind of external confirmation, inevitability started to unravel, echo of what he was already aware of. But he had not yet identified any indication that he was feeding the sheriff. Continued to move his weight uneasily. There was no pulling. It was simply ripped apart and left there as a warning or whatever. Did it for one set of clean tracks and then nothing else, but not for meals. Disappeared into the brush, as if it had never been there. Harold glanced at the steps under his boots and then looked up at the. He inquired quietly in the woods behind the sheriff's truck if the body had a knife. Hanley hesitated, then squinted. "How did you know?" Harold didn't. Instead, he turned and silently walked back into the house, returning a moment later with the. Under the oak tree, he discovered a small wooden talisman with a hand-carved wolf image hanging on a length of string. Weather and time have blackened the surface, and the etched runes catch just enough afternoon light to appear as though they were While it was still being written, the sheriff glanced at it and stood back. "As you can see, Jesus, Harold." Harold said no, "But I believe it does." The sheriff remained silent for a while. After staring at the talisman for a long time, as if it may move by itself, he cleared his throat and began to ascend carefully, returning to his truck, murmuring something about full moons and locked doors, and phoning if things seemed off. But Harold was already aware that the weirdness had passed and remained because it wasn't going to be long. Stretch, which he could sense in his bones, the trees, and the ground beneath his feet, was more than simply a wolf and one protective deed. It was a long-standing pattern, order, and presence before him, and would outlive any flimsy echoes of civilization that claimed to rule this area of the forest. He was not, whether by chance inheritance or some unseen rite of passage. He was no longer merely a spectator. He was suddenly involved, whether he was prepared or not. Harold found himself falling into a cadence that felt familiar only in form in the days after the sheriff's visit, but was now tinged with a restless undertone that would not let the... Still up at the light, the hens were fed, the fencing was inspected, and the wood was chopped in measured strokes like a metronome. But where those duties were formerly silent routines intended to maintain his heart's stability and his mind's clarity, they now served as diversions and stand-ins for ideas he was unable to suppress for inquiries that became so loud in the quiet he had formerly desired that he was unable to stroll around the edge of his property without catching. He paused in the middle of his stride, his gaze straying to the tree line as though anticipating no, feeling as though someone or something was observing from just out of reach of. His vision was one of solemnity rather than malice or even curiosity. Scrutiny that implied condemnation, as though the forest itself had developed eyes and was using a scale to measure each breath. He was still unaware that the nights were the most difficult for him to fall asleep, and unbroken had been split apart into uncomfortable pieces as dreams seeped into the real world and the line. He would fall asleep as the gap between memory and imagination grew more difficult to maintain, only to wake up again in. The woodland surrounding him was dead silent, the clearing beneath the white oak, the talisman hanging from his palm, and there is a presence in the darkness that is not visible but is gradually getting closer, patient and unwavering, and he would wake up shortly before facing it, heart thumping with something uncannily similar to adoration instead of terror. Harold stole the ancient oil light because he couldn't sleep at night and was so consumed by an urge that he stopped asking questions. He flung his coat over his shoulders from the hook beside the entrance and went barefoot onto the chilly porch. As he stood beneath the great lunar sky that stretched silver and cloudless above the trees, the wind cut his ankles. The talisman he currently wore was like a lid that had just been pulled off the planet. A leather string around his neck moved gently on his chest. It wasn't heavy, but it was there enough to make his skin tingled slightly with awareness. He wasn't entirely sure where he was heading, but his feet carried him in that direction. The property's rear edge, past the fallen shed, and along the inclining trail that leads to the gully that formerly delineated the... Harold had seldom been to the unclaimed wilderness beyond, even as a child, but not because he was afraid of it, but because it had always seemed uncaring, like a realm all its own where men weren't important. And time didn't go by in quantifiable ways, and the moonlight was sufficiently bright for him to not use a lamp. But as he entered the gully and proceeded up the small deer route, he kept it burning more for its warmth than its radiance. That went into the woods. He became aware that he was no longer considering the wolf, the attack, or even the sheriff's caution, but his thoughts were racing to a much more unsettling reality that part of. He had yearned for this location to return, much like a kid longs for the sound of its mother's voice in the dark because it had seen him and, rather than promising solutions, had compelled him to see himself since, in reality, Harold had led a life influenced by solitude, not because he was at peace, but because retreat he had distanced himself from others, not because they let him down, but because he had let himself down. Saw a son slink away and blamed the father for it. Lost a wife to illness and blamed himself for not recognizing it sooner. Instead of attempting to contact him, the globe had endured the pain of war and constructed a peaceful universe in which he was untouchable until something did, and now that. He couldn't help but sense that whatever force had stepped in that night had not just appeared in the silence of these woods. Shield him, but to face him and pull him back into reality by bringing him to face. When he came to a tiny clearing, he stopped walking because he felt a connection with something far bigger than himself. Though it felt strangely familiar, the circular area encircled by dense pines was anything he could recall from any of his early wanderings. Soft, naked soil underfoot, with a circle of stones in the middle that had, evidently positioned rather than dispersed as though by ancient hands, he stood there for what felt like hours. The trees surrounding him creaked softly, the wind was still, and the talisman, warming up against his chest, and slowly a notion came to him in that stillness. Heavy, there is no denying that you were saved. Now, decide how you will use it. And, for the first, Harold Weston felt, over the years, not old, broken, or alone, but choose the morning following his entry into the area, which was surrounded by stones, silent, and weighed down by an antique object that Harold woke up after it made its point obvious despite its refusal to communicate. To discover that the stillness that permeates the house is not the tranquility that comes with the early hours of the day on a farm. He sat up, though, since it seems like the world has stopped, holding its breath, not in expectancy, but in alarm. As his limbs began to stiffen from the cold, and his dreams continued to cling to him like mist, he became aware that the lantern he had carried the previous evening, which he left on the kitchen counter upon his return, and it was now just before dawn. Its flame flickered dimly, blowing at the base and dancing in a manner that reminded him of breath rather than wind, as if someone invisible were standing next to it, watching, waiting, and stepping. He anticipated that the typical murmur of morning birds would greet him outside, and that the cold of late autumn would sting his face, the treetops, but instead he encountered an odd silence that seemed too complete, strange, and the sky had become so pale and gray that it appeared to have been painted like a veil, tightened over the sun, with no birds, no tree movement, not even. He saw it close after hearing a coyote's distant bark from across the ridge. Just past the old wagon wheel, which he had mounted years prior, is the fence line at the northern boundary of the land. A figure stood in front of the handmade landmark, not moving, not approaching, just there, height, stooped forward a little, wearing black clothes that matched the trees behind it, and Harold could tell who it was even though his vision wasn't as good as it used to be. Weren't local, they didn't appear lost, aimless, or inquisitive. Instead, they stood like. He didn't call out, he didn't move, and, after what seemed like a minute, Tao was stretched into 100. Harold, the figure turned slowly and methodically and returned to the woods without even looking at the cabin. He stood frozen, unable to explain what he had seen, identify the person, or what had come to his country, but it was the sensation that it was there that most unsettled him. Hadn't come to get him, but rather to check something nearby and get that silent affirmation. By lunchtime, the sky had become much darker, and the echoes were louder than any threat. Like the breath of a large sleeping animal, the wind has returned, blowing steadily, coldly, and lowly. Harold spent the majority of the afternoon indoors, with the talisman still dangling from his neck as it stirred in its sleep. Now, even though the rest of the house was cold, it felt warm on his skin. He sat by the fire, reading through his. Every time he reviewed the portion his grandfather's old journal labeled, "Watchers Growing Thinner," he noticed something he had not previously noticed: a handwritten note in the margins of one of the final pages, hardly readable, but clearly urgent. Not everyone who arrives is a guardian. Some people follow. Some feeds maintain the words chilled him, not only because they said, "Circle never sleep where it's broken," satisfied, but for the knowledge that the stone circle he had discovered was so intentional, so obviously kept, may have been intended for confinement rather than devotion or remembering. And he had walked, standing in the middle of it. It was broken by the lack of sleep at night. Rather, Harold sat with a candle burning next to him and his rifle across his lap, staring at the window that turned to the crest, his ears straining for a sound that never materialized, and he reasoned that whatever this force was, whether it was a myth or memory of a predator or a guardian, it had chosen him, and by the time the sun rose again, he was too pallid to pretend that he wasn't drawn to it in return. Harold had hardly been able to burn through the cloud veil that had hovered motionless over the valley for almost 2 days, made a choice that was inevitable and not the result of bravery or conviction, the sort of silent. A man experiences acceptance when he understands that waiting, closed doors, and loaded firearms are futile. He packed carefully that morning, moving with the intention of preventing something old and meaningful from knocking when it's ready to be let in. The serenity of someone loading a used canvas bag with a coffee thermos, not for battle, but for revelation. His grandfather's journal was now wrinkled, along with a little hunting knife and a coil of rope, and stained from years of use, its spine buckling beneath the weight of highlighted sentences and pages that were once had the weight of prophecy around his neck and read like a folk tale. The talisman felt more like a key that hadn't yet showed him the door it belonged to than a charm or relic, which seemed to indicate that the window for asking questions had closed and that the moment for crossing the boundary had. When he arrived, he left a brief and signed note on the table in case anyone happened to look, but he wasn't sure they would. He went to listen after reading merely 3 sentences written in heavy pencil over the ripped corner of a feed catalog, and then he moved. This time, he didn't halt at the tree line before venturing out into the wind. Could look back with both comfort and terror at the cabin that had housed him for decades, because something deep inside, for the first time in his lengthy life, he had changed, not out of panic, but in a mint. Harold Weston's life felt more like he was moving through the forest than he was living next to it. Even if he didn't recall it from his childhood, his feet seemed to locate the small, meandering, almost animal path that followed. Its subtlety is sculpted by time, repetition, and something more purposeful than by human hands or wheels. Then erosion. And even after walking for what seemed like hours, the light remained the same, and his watch, which had long. After stopping, he found himself standing in the clearing once more, believing he had accidentally found the one with the. He was not by himself this time as he stood at the distant edge of the ring of stones and the air that never quite moved. Circle was a woman with silver streak hair braided who was neither young nor old. Her stance was comfortable, her eyes steady, and she had a large wool shawl wrapped across her shoulders and down her back. Harold froze, not because he was afraid, but because he knew he was coming and had been waiting longer than she wanted to acknowledge. Everything within him warned him that this was the crucial moment, and that whatever happened next would permanently alter him. In the grandiose manner of tales involving heroes and monsters, but in the silent, irrevocable manner that truth transforms the. You crossed the ring, shape of memory, she continued, her voice carrying effortlessly in spite of. Harold said, I don't know what it was, but you stayed, she. The distance was clear and low, like a wind blowing over stone. Murmured, slowly nodding. And that's what counts. She moved forward rather than into the ring, but nearer to it, and pointed at the stones, saying, they're not just to keep something out. They are meant to remind whatever resides there not to leave. It's a relationship, certainly, but also a boundary. Harold didn't inquire as to what. She was saying that he already knew that as he entered the circle once more, the wind immediately stopped. Not because however, because it had identified him as though by some invisible current. The air had become still, had stopped to consider if he belonged. You bear the mark, the woman replied, pointing to the talisman. Doesn't happen by accident. It's inherited or given. Harold felt its warmth as he stared down at it, not as a glow this time, but my grandfather spoke slowly, the words fitting together as he spoke, like a pulse. He used to vanish into the woods for days at a time, never revealing his whereabouts. Back distinct, the woman nodded, stating that he was a member of the first circle. Harold's question was answered by elderly watchers, not guardians or warriors. Didn't respond. Instead, she gazed into the shadows between the tree trunks. Harold stood in the stone circle for what seemed like an eternity, where something big and patient was listening, not because he was confined or because anything forced him to stay, but rather because of something in the area, Time seemed to be suspended in a way that made each second sound rich and resonant, like a bell tone that refused to fade, and his thoughts stopped racing and colliding in that suspension. However, the woman whose name was slowly floating through his memory like leaves trapped in the current of a deep, slow-moving river. He was sitting on a fallen log just outside the ring with her jaw drawn tighter, but he still didn't know and didn't feel the need to inquire. Surrounding her as the wind started to blow once more, around the circle, but never crossing its edge, as though After explaining his grandfather's involvement among the first, she had said little, showing respect for what was inside. Harold and Circle no longer had to fill in blanks with inquiries. He was happy to let the silence develop, as if comprehension would come via presence rather than responses. Eventually, even though she spoke more softly, her tone became more introspective. There are tales of guys who go too far into the... She described a hole, with eyes focused on the horizon where the trees had bled into mist. Some of them returned, chatting to themselves. Some never return at all. The elderly used to claim that what woke up when they were taken wasn't the forest. Harold moved a little when they went into areas they weren't supposed to go through. The stones underfoot rooted him more securely than any floor, and the talisman pressing warmly against his chest. "Have you crossed?" he said, not suspiciously but genuinely curiously, since if someone, still alive, had witnessed what was beyond, and it was her. "I have," she said once. "I did something I shouldn't have done a while back. Not intentionally, but I was searching for someone who had already passed away," and Harold thought he heard her voice crack a little at the last syllable. Didn't push her, allowing the pain to seep into the distance between them. "And what did you find?" he inquired. The woman glanced at him for a minute before not directly, but her eyes moved through his face like wind through branches, and I discovered what was waiting for me. Those who fail to remember that this location is older than death and older than memory. Harold felt his breath, and I discovered what feeds when the equilibrium is upset. He had felt it too, hadn't he? He caught it not out of fear, but out of identification. The wolf didn't seem rabid or random the night the outlaw broke into his house and almost spilled blood. However, something that was controlled by conscious decision had not replied to him. A thread broke due to a rule infringement, and he now realized that the forest was more concerned with order than with right or wrong, innocence or guilt, and he had taken that command. The woman stood, then moved slowly but firm and indicated a small, hardly perceptible trail where the trees grew on the far side of the clearing. Their trunks are twisted and blackened by age, making them impossible to be close to one another. She said, "What your grandfather saw and helped hold back," as she waited there. Harold didn't inquire what it was, but if it identifies you, it will allow you to find it even though it doesn't want to be found. When realities are pushed into words, they lose their shape. Instead, he paused to take a breath, leaving the circle and moving in the direction of the path, feeling the chain and the air pressure nearly immediately, thickening the forest noises until even the sound of his own boots hitting the ground seemed far away. Like hearing footsteps in a dream, the trees surrounded him, and the light dimmed until it looked like dusk. It was just mid-afternoon, and as he went farther, he felt as though he was being watched again, not with menace, but with gravity, as though each leaf, shadow, and air molecule were observing. He heard it after documenting his presence and comparing it to the memories of those who had previously traversed the same trail. It said in a gentle voice that was neither howling nor growling, nor was it quite human or animal. He broke the pack, and it was the only thing that caused the jungle to go completely silent. Harold hesitated, not because he was afraid of what was farther in the woods, nor because the voice was so quiet and eerie, and apparently carried by something older and denser than air, but because of something in the ground itself had changed subtly but clearly beneath his feet, resembling a stream altering its course beneath the surface of a river. And that change brought about the unavoidable realization that, beyond this invisible border, whatever weighed on it was no longer a part of the reality he had always known, but rather, the world he had always known did not recognize the path ahead as a trail, at least not in the manner that men mark such things with maps, signs, and boots, but instead a twisting, narrow impression in the ground formed by something other than HUMI, nor if the moss that hung from the branches above him was breathing on its own or moving softly in the breeze. Accord, he moved more slowly with each step, not because of fear or hesitancy, but rather because the very walking now seemed to be an act of respect, as though the earth itself needed to be parisi, not into the darkness, but into. He became aware that he could no longer hear amid a sort of perpetual dusk, where shape and shadow blended together indistinguishably. The sound of twigs shattering beneath his boots, the wind, or even his own breath, as though a curtain had been pulled by the jungle, surrounding this location that suppressed sound and sound memory. And then, the woods abruptly split, not into a clearing, as soon as the silence had started, into openness or light, but into something more profound and hollow, a kind of basin buried in the ground like a lost bowl with a center carved by old hands or by time itself. Of this void was a tall, still person whose face was shrouded by fur, shadow, and clothing. Appeared to be a mask made from pieces of dark wood and animal bone that were joined not with thread, but with sinew as impossibly still as Harold, darkened by the weather, ash, or blood. The figure twisted its complete body, not just its head, as it got closer to the basin's edge with the slow, inexorable motion of a mountain moving to face the wind, and something, not words, passed between them in that one motion. Not even ideas, but the kind of recognition that doesn't need justification. Because, like meeting someone you've never seen before, it exists outside of time, and somehow being aware that they have been approaching you all your life, and in that, even though Harold didn't say anything out loud, he understood in the same way that trees do. The same way wolves know where to halt traveling and wait for this figure of thing. They also know which way to lean toward the sun. This ancient and impossibly present presence was there to contribute something, but not to frighten or console. The figure simply moved forward once, unveiled by formality or assurance, and was as real and substantial as the earth under him. And something little, a talisman, emerged from behind its frayed covering, similar to his own, but darker, with age and burnt edges and an etched surface. Had slightly pulsing marks that suggested the memory of fire was still present in them and was not extended with. Harold reached out with force, but it was inevitable. It wasn't because he was brave or because he comprehended, but he felt a sense of belonging because his blood had long before provided the answer. The forest breathed that it wasn't a question before he realized it had been posed, and as soon as his fingers closed around the object, a gust of wind, which was more like a change in lung pressure than sound in the conventional sense, globe, and Harold saw through something deeper than his eyes at that moment. Visions that weren't of the future or the outlaw of the past, but of memory passing in absolute silence under a blood moon. Just before he passed away, his soul was already known, counted, and ultimately, Harold himself, older, standing at the circle's edge, shrouded in shadow, observing another person come closer, the same astonishment and horror, now consuming his chest, and then the figure retreated. The pact was presented, and without uttering a word, without kneeling, and without requesting anything in return. Since this was neither a contract nor an option not in place, Harold nodded. It was a remembrance of Harold Weston, the farmer, and the duty of watching, as most men define such things. The veteran widower witness was now a part of something bigger than the trees. Let him go with ease following the conversation and the time in the hole when the talisman had left the creatures. When the tree's breath had changed all about him, like the turning of a giant, Harold felt the world shift as a deep internal tilt rather than a tremor, as if the axis of an ancient object had been changed by a fraction, changing the balance of meaning as well as space and width. That tilt brought with it a weight that was existential rather than physical, as if his presence in the forest that now reverberated in areas he couldn't see and attracted attention he hadn't meant to. The return stroll was different since the once narrow and twisting trail felt twisted by each tree, creating longer shadows than was feasible, with branches that seemed to be testing him rather than reaching over him. Unsure of whether he was now a protector or a disruptor, the new burden he bore raised questions. When the wind came low and leisurely, the birds did not whisper back, breathing heavily while scuttling through the leaves and moving down the woodland floor, which brushed against his legs like smoke. Harold experienced a sense of purposeful clarity as he traveled from Hollow to his home. The deeper, more unsettling dread is not the fear of being hunted. Apprehension about being recognized when he came out of the forest shortly before sunset was already bruising into rust and iron tones, and his cabin was often of solidity, or at least comfort, now appeared somewhat unusual, as though it had moved a little on its foundations while he was abroad, or as though someone had gone through it and rearranged everything without his presence. But the hens were purposefully gone. Not dead, not dispersed, just gone. Harold stood quietly for a while, with no blood, feathers, or damaged fence. With the coop door remained locked from the outside. Moment in the yard, eyes searching every nook and cranny and finding nothing. He felt the absence of more than just the animals as they moved, and no sound reached him. Also of something more profound, as though a line had been crossed and the forest, which was previously kept at bay by unwritten regulations, has moved forward to test the limits of its newly packed household items. Were unaltered, the blanket was still folded at the foot of his chair, and the kettle was still cold on the stove, yet the air felt warmer and thicker, as though a fire had just burned, leaving its breath behind and on. The table was positioned just in the middle, as if someone had taken care to avoid disturbing the other seats. Harold did not burn this smaller, rougher talisman, which was carved hurriedly. He didn't touch it yet, since he realized instantly and instinctively that this was a warning that someone else had recently breached the promise. It wasn't a gift. Whomever really observed from behind the fur veil and the bush, whatever it was, not far from here, and Root, an old Entangled's memory, was reacting and no longer waiting as he sat. The bigger talisman he now wore slowly descended like a weight in the middle of his chest, pushing warm on his ribcage as though to tell him that neutrality was no longer an option and that his quiet was no longer permitted. You couldn't return to just live after you had entered the hollow and nodded. You had to pretend that you didn't get any sleep at all, not even in little bits. Harold sat by the fire with both talismans in front of him, one new and jagged, the other antique and thoughtful. I heard the long, slow sound of a living memory getting ready to be released as the forest breathed on the windows. Rewritten, he heard the howl just after midnight, not close nor far away, but below, as if it were rose from the floorboards beneath his feet were deep, mournful, and furiously patched. Stood since it was now a dead issue, rather than a belief issue. When Harold went outside, the cold met him with something or someone who was going to pay it, not as wind or weather, but as a thick, immobile wall that is oddly quiet as. Despite the fact that the temperature had decreased, not by degrees, but rather by choice, and the forest beyond his. They were held somewhere just outside by the warmth, activity, and life that the yard had breathed. Like a breath not yet released or a decision not yet made. Reach didn't. He didn't need to carry his gun because what was going to happen wouldn't be fought with it. So he just brought a flashlight. This was a device that had its own light, whether it was illuminated by artificial rays or bullets. Without hesitating, he passed the barn, which was now oddly hollow, the bare coop, and the tree line. The talisman around his neck was dimly illuminated by the warmth of a heartbeat that seemed to be directing him without direction, but with a tug, and as he stepped through Shadow's first door. The forest response was not one of welcome or animosity, but rather of profound acknowledgement, akin to the silence of a crowd when a figure enters a stage that has been waiting for him all. The trail was more constrained than before, or perhaps the trees' inward-leaning trunks were the only reason it seemed that way. Their branches were arranged in a canopy so dense and tangled that the night above was as dense as ribs surrounding a heart. He vanished entirely, but he continued to walk without slowing down or faltering, because deep down, beneath the uncertainty, beneath the age-related pain, beneath the silent sorrow that had been inside of him something had known the way for decades. It wasn't recollection, it was heredity, and he realized he had when the ground started to slope downward and the silence broke, not with sound, but with presence, reached the hollow's base, a shape that was different from. Previously, this one was smaller, but just as awful despite being covered in layers of fabric. Crouched low next to a tree whose roots twisted out like veins bursting from the ground, saturated dark with weather and age. Harold was aware of the ground, even if it lacked a face or recognizable shape. For what it was, not the criminal, not the stranger who had assaulted him weeks before, but the one who broke the pack. Like poison spilled into a stream, something older, something that had led that guy, murmured into his consciousness. Harold pushed him in the direction of violence, not for survival, but for chaos and violation. The Watchers were intended to contain not only the wild, but also the broken, the forgotten, and the cast. As the instant stretched out by balance and supported by the fissures in order, the figure did not move. Instead, it breathed slowly and shallowly from inside a sound, a rasping, damp whisper that did not form a word, came from the folds of its rags, yet nevertheless had significance, much like ash floating from a long-dead fire. And Harold took a step forward, the talisman now searing on his chest as his feet sank a little into the wet ground. "You know what this is," he remarked in a low voice, not with pain but with urgency. The object tilted slightly, as though listening, as though knowing the voice, and there was more supplication than demand. Not just Harold's, but as a reflection of others who had been here before him, whose blood now throbbed through his. Embers refused to die when you crossed, and memories awoke inside the amulet. Harold proceeded without authorization, breaking the circle and taking what wasn't yours to touch, and he then completely entered the void in the surrounding air, thickening immediately, becoming as heavy as water, making it difficult to breathe, yet not all at once, not all at once, swiftly yet slowly, as if something were slowly resuming its shape, its limbs spreading out like smoke curling back into flame, and as it continued, it expanded in both height and presence, filling the space around it with a chill that pricked memory rather than skin, similar to the sensation of. Harold did not recoil in the face of a childhood terror that you believed you had forgotten until it was revealed to you. Since his goal was restoration rather than victory, he took the talisman from his neck and held it up between. Like a fireball, he went forward and yelled, "One last time, you can't stay." The forest erupted in sound as soon as those words were uttered. Not a roar or a scream, but the collective wail of every silent witness, every watcher, and every guardian concealed among the trees, emerging from the shadows like the voices of. When the stones finally spoke, the figure lunged, but not Harold, toward the talisman and the light, and it did not collide with it when it struck. Crumbled, dissolving into dust, wind, and shadow strands that were drawn backward into the soil's roots. Harold plunged through the world's breath, leaving nothing but quiet behind him. One he did not hurt when it was released because the agreement had been upheld and he had preserved it. Dawn arrived gradually, not with a dazzling display or a joyous celebration, but with a darkness lifted softly, as if a curtain were being carefully drawn back from the face of something that had been sleeping for a long time, and was now prepared to open its eyes in order to remember the brightness rather than pass judgment. Seeped through the trees as pale silver ribbons that moved like breath-touching, rather than as warm rays or golden shafts. As though reintroducing themselves to a forest, the moss and branches of the earth. It had squeezed its lungs tightly against something for a short, horrible moment. Harold stood at the edge of the hollow, where the ground sloped gently upward, and there was a silence that seemed unnatural. The remains of the night's weight were still faintly pushing down as his boots sank slightly into the wet ground on the way home, hitting his shoulders with the kind of anguish a man feels, not with weight, but with finality. Sensations after excavating the final grave, shutting the final door, and realizing that something ended, not with a commotion, but with the realization that he no longer held. The talisman disappeared as soon as the form turned into dust, not disintegrating or burning, but unweaving as. Even so, the warmth that had pulsated against it had never been made of matter, but rather of memory held together by will. For days, his chest was gone, But he didn't feel empty without it, felt balanced. And in some way, as he ascended gently back toward the cabin, the trail, shorter than it had been on the way in, and he heard a soft, returning sound. Not instantly, but gradually, like a songbird tentatively attempting to sing. A crow was trickling by water in a distant location after a storm caused the leaves to ruffle once more. Harold called once, quick and straightforward. The hens had not come back, and the forest was breathing back at the house. Didn't anticipate that some items, once taken, aren't supposed to be returned due to punishment, but rather because nature has a system of exchange that it uses logically when it takes. He boiled water for tea, not because he wanted it, but because it is frequently unnoticeable but never unfair. Needed it, but the ceremony grounded him, and, as he stood with his mug at the window, observing the line of, he sensed the change as trees that had previously delineated the boundary of his land suddenly delineated the boundary of something much deeper. Firmly establish himself, he was no longer only Harold Weston. Instead, he was now a node in the enormous, silent network of equilibrium, blood, and breath that flows through the. He would keep the dirt, the stones, and the bones of all the creatures that had ever passed through here a secret out of respect. These stories weren't intended for the sheriff or the circle woman, even though he had a suspicion that she would know. They were intended to be held rather than spoken later for headlines or conversations. Harold took a moment to glance down at the front gate as he was fixing it with hands that were no longer shaking. A fresh talisman was lying on the ground next to the post he was anchoring, nearly concealed by a curl of dry grass. Like the others, this one was polished and smooth, and it was a wolf's head that was simply lovely to look at as he took it up and grinned, not because he was shocked, but rather because he wasn't, as the watchers came in a variety of shapes, and now he was. If this story left you feeling burdened or with a question in your heart, please continue to watch this channel. It was created only for you, and each tale serves as a gateway to the unknown, which is full of exciting possibilities. Heard something worthwhile? Sign up for more stories like this one, where fiction and reality collide beneath the trees. So if you're prepared to continue on to the next thread, don't stop here. Comprises a variety of voices. You've just heard one. Now listen to another.